The Road to Happy Valley. Camp Montvale in the 1960s in Blount County, Tennessee, was on the frontier by today's standards. We did have a swimming pool, but it was icy mountain spring fed, and there was little mercy extended. No reasons offered for why us boys had to be in the water while receiving verbal swimming instruction from the counselors who were not in the water. I think it was a little like the irrationality of Army boot camp, intentional irrationality, so you could get used to the way life was going to be. Or at least that's the way boot camp used to be. Plus, as a budding young mathematician, I perceived unfairness in the volume to surface area ratio mismatch between us 10-year-olds and the hulking athletes who were teaching us to swim. We were much colder than they would have been because we had less interior guts volume compared to surface skin area for absorbing the cold. I was thinking I might try to make that right if I ever became a counselor, but later I learned that a little unfair cold water is good for strengthening a young man. Message to the greatest generation. If you come back from a war and don't tell your kids what you suffered and how your buddies died and what they died for, then what the hell do you expect if the younger generation is a bunch of crybabies? But I digress. Now, in those days, out-of-line behavior at the camp was punished, even in the case of pilfering from the kitchen, for instance, with expulsion from the camp. Parents had to come and get the little transgressors. I sure am glad I wasn't in that car going back home. No tuition refund, and the parents' free time, which they had waited 10 years for, now impinged. Those were the days of corporal punishment by some. We saw some of it delivered right there before two brothers were put back into the family pickup. It was bad. I already knew that deviating from the proper path was risky, though I never would have deviated in that way. I was more in the wise guy category. But I do mention it because I had already determined that any deviations in my own future ledger would be chosen with careful consideration for risk and reward. The camp, of course, was a kid's paradise. Ball fields, spooky stories around a fire, skills to learn, hide-and-seek games. Concealing yourself was my favorite part of that game, although my real skill was finding others who thought they were cleverly concealed. The big event was the overnight hike to Happy Valley. Who wouldn't want to go to Happy Valley? Give me Happy Valley over Sleepy Hollow any day. It was at least a 5-mile walk to Happy Valley, although it might have been only a couple miles over the ridge as the crow flies. Our sleeping bags and food would go by truck, and we would hike it on a dirt road consisting of many Z-shaped switchbacks up to the top of the intervening steep ridge and back down the other side. At some point, as I was trudging along with 40 or 50 campers all strung out in a long line, I got the feeling that it would be more efficient and much less hot and dusty to cut straight up the ridge instead of zigzagging back and forth. The only reason you have to do Z's is if you have a vehicle. On foot, you can just go. So why not go? The reasonable thing to do. At a sharp turning point of one of the Z's, I saw a trail heading up in the right direction. I pointed at it after looking to see if any counselors were in sight, and then led a couple of co-conspirators quickly into the trees. I was aware of the risk, but the reward seemed defensible with mathematical logic. The pleasure of an efficient geometric solution versus some risk of being confined to cabin and missing the cookies at evening vespers. Not that bad. The first thing I noticed was how much cooler it was in the forest. There was a carpet of millions of little white and yellow flowers, and the trees above had yellow and purple blooms. I now know that those low flowers were wood sorrel, and the high tree flowers were tulip poplar and peyote tree. But I didn't know that then. It seemed to me like paradise. The trail went pretty much straight up the hill, so I figured my bet would be rewarded. We would hit one of the switchbacks again, saving a lot of dusty heat in the beating sun of the road. I lay down on the mat of flowers and looked up at the treetops for a while. We intersected back with the dusty road ahead of the column of boys. From the trees, I saw one of the provision trucks make the painful turn to zigzag back the other way. The trail continued up, and I now felt confident I had beat the system. I might be able to front-run the trucks themselves to Happy Valley. When we got to the zag point at the top of the ridge, we could see that the dusty road went straight for quite a ways to the east, very inefficient, whereas the trail bore steeply and directly down the far side. My two buddies decided to hit the dusty road again, taking their chips off the table while still ahead. I went on down over the ridge, thinking it had to be faster. The time I would pick up would give me plenty of time to get back on track, even if it didn't come out at exactly the right place. I took off at a joyous run down on the invitingly wide trail. The footing was good, and at that speed I would be at the bottom in no time, long ahead of the others. The trail suddenly turned hard west and flattened into an open meadow. It worried me a bit, but I continued swiftly along the path even though it was clearly not going down anymore. In fact, it started up. The vegetation changed more to hemlock spruce, and it felt a little chilly. I noticed the mountain laurels had not yet bloomed, which meant that I was now at a higher elevation, which didn't seem to make sense. I also heard a raven. I was dressed in a t-shirt and had one of the old green canvas-covered canteens and a couple of Baby Ruth bars. I knew that wasn't really enough if I had to spend the night out there, but there was still plenty of daylight. At last, I came to a southern turn that looked like it would go down into the valley. Disappointingly, the trail went down at first, but quickly started up again. I checked the sun. At least I was still going south. Then the trail went virtually straight up. I decided to go up the last 100 feet or so, even though I was getting pretty close to turning around. At the least, I would be able to see into the distance and maybe get my bearings up there higher up. When I stepped out of the trees, I was in an open, grassy area on the edge of a placid blue sky lake that was 100 feet or so across. In the distance were mountain peaks that did not look at all familiar, and certainly did not look like Happy Valley. I heard a rustling off to my right and crouched down. A large white-tailed buck with many points emerged from the brush and seemed to look right at me. He was quite close. He made a decision and continued on towards the lake. I now saw that he was hurt. He was dragging his back leg and was bleeding. I thought he had been shot. When he got to the edge of the water, he turned and looked at me again. His eyes looked worn and tired. Then he waded in and started swimming. I could see he was having a little trouble holding his magnificent rack of antlers above the surface. I was afraid he might not be able to stay up. But then he circled back strongly and emerged and shook himself. Again he looked right at me. His eyes seemed brighter. He seemed to be standing taller and stronger. He bounded up into the trees behind me and disappeared. He was no longer dragging his wounded leg. I felt a very contented feeling, as if I could stay there forever. I stopped thinking about Happy Valley for a while. It was very comfortable. The sky and the water were very blue. And then I began to feel a little chilly, as if it were getting late. I ate one of my baby Ruths. I drank the rest of my water, and I thought about refilling my canteen in the lake. And then I began to feel a little afraid. I hadn't really felt afraid or lost all day, but now I did. I had the feeling that I shouldn't be there, or that I had been there too long. I got up and went back the way I had come. I didn't seem to recognize anything along that trail going back. I worried that I was truly and completely lost. I took a couple of unfamiliar turns that I knew were wrong, but were at least in the right direction. But then, in no time, too little time, I felt uneasily. I got back on what looked like that wide, straight down the side of the ridge trail that I had been on before. It was much warmer and drier, hot even. I went running and sliding all the way straight to the bottom. I must have covered 1,000 vertical feet in about 3 minutes. I came out on an east-west blacktop road. This was going to work. This road had to connect up to Happy Valley Road. I was going to get there in plenty of time. I had come out right near a very run-down, Pure brand gas station with old rusting cars all around the yard. A wrinkled, gnarled guy, very thin, in very long-worn, leathery clothes, was doing some kind of work around the pumps. It didn't look like a very prosperous business location. I walked over and addressed the old fellow, who I now realized was even older than I had thought. I know how grown-ups did this. I said, "Excuse me, sir, could you direct me to Happy Valley?" He looked at me wearily. His eyes reminded me of the buck I had just seen up at the lake before he had gone for his swim, worn and tired. He pointed down the road. Not the direction I was expecting, but I figured I could make it easily. I knew that the last mile to Happy Valley was supposed to be on pavement. They had told us that. I saw a water spigot and motioned my empty canteen toward it. He nodded. I walked over and filled. I also used a nickel to buy a Snickers bar from an ancient vending machine. All the other choices were multi-flavored lifesavers. As I turned to go, the old man said, matter-of-factly, but with a solemn edge, "You have seen the lake of Atagahi. You must never reveal its location. It is where the animals go to heal themselves if they are hurt or wounded. People can go there too. If you reveal its location, it will disappear forever. This is the command of the Cherokee." I nodded. When I got to the Happy Valley turn, I saw the oncoming column of kids, and I slipped into the bushes and stepped out as they were passing, making like I had been taking a piss. When we were bedding down that evening, one of the counselors said, "Hey, where'd you get the Snickers bar?" "At the Pure Station," I answered. "Pure Station?" he said. I recollected that particular counselor, before we had set out, had told us that he grew up around Happy Valley, so we couldn't possibly get lost around there. He seemed puzzled at the mention of a Pure station. Many years later, I got to wondering, and I rented a car in Knoxville and drove to Happy Valley. Nowadays, there is a scenic highway at the top of the ridge with all kinds of traffic whizzing by. Down off the ridge, I drove past the Happy Valley turnoff. About a quarter mile to the west was about where I had come down off the mountain all those years ago. The brush was quite thick along there, but there was one flatter place where the brush wasn't as tall that could have held gas pumps. I stopped the car and poked around and found what looked like an old porch. In the dirt in front was a rounded piece of board that could have been part of a faded blue and white commercial Pure sign with a serrated star pattern. If the matter were to come up, I don't recall the old man saying anything about not revealing where there may or may not have been a Pure gas station back in the early 1960s.